Assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. I believe we can chalk up another win to the win column for us crazy people with data centers, racks, space heaters, home labs, whatever you want to call them, because at least in a decent amount of the U.S., like the Midwest and Northeast, they've experienced quite a bit of a cold snap the past week or so, and us home labbers with our space heaters, we can just easily live life in luxury, basking in the heat that our home labs are pumping out while we enjoy watching the snowfall, while the normies out there without data centers in their house are, huddled in their blankets while their HVAC struggles to keep the heat running, to keep the house warm. I kid, of course, but I'm also not going to sit here and deny the fact that if I close the door to my office, which is currently where my rack sits, it gets noticeably warmer, and to the point where if I then proceed to open the door, it's like a completely different climate inside versus outside of the room. Specifically, if this is in the summertime, it becomes basically unlivable in that room. It could easily get well over 80 degrees, and yeah, it gets pretty toasty in there. But I've also noticed too, like if I'm working on something within the rack, and I'm just kind of around it a lot, even if it's like cold in the house, like I'll still notice that like I'm kind of starting to sweat because I'm around all these servers pumping out a bunch of heat. And if I look at the management interface for some of my servers, like it's saying, the exhaust temp coming out of the back of these guys is like, 40 some degrees Celsius. I'm not exactly sure what that translates to Fahrenheit, but pretty darn warm. So yeah, that's us with home servers and home labs are probably not doing too bad. I guess at least if you're sitting close to it, and maybe it's helping with your heating bill, maybe letting the HVAC not have to work as hard, maybe. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Let's start this episode off with our trivia question for the week. Which cereal brand included a toy capable of producing the 2600 hertz tone used by phone phreakers to give them free long-distance calls? Bonus points if you can name the toy itself. So that was, what cereal brand included a toy capable of producing the 2600 hertz tone used by phone phreakers that would allow them free long-distance phone calls? And that is your trivia question for the week. And last week we talked about the Vision Pro being able to go on pre-order. And as of the recording of this podcast, I do believe that pre-orders have been opened for about a day or so now. So I'm curious if any of you were able to get your pre-order in. I know I sure didn't. I don't exactly have, $3,500 burning a hole in my pocket at the moment. So I decided to hold off. Plus, I decided, even if I did have $3,500 burning a hole in my pocket, that I would let the guinea pigs go review it first to actually see if it's worth purchasing, since currently, as of now, really all we have is like some first impressions that people got that have been able to try it, but no actual kind of like reviews or anything of it. So I guess time will tell how it actually is. But yeah, like I said, I don't exactly have $3,500 burning a hole in my pocket. But if you out there did purchase one, I would be interested to hear what your thoughts are on it once it arrives. So definitely reach out, contact@darkassassins.inc.com if you ended up getting one. And also, if you have any questions, comments, or topics for the show, you can send an email to that address too. Link is down in the show notes. And with that, let's move into this week's cybersecurity tip. So this week's cybersecurity tip is another one of those, I'm not exactly sure why I'm saying it, because to me, this just seems like common sense, but apparently it's not. And that is that you should not be exposing your management interfaces to the internet. Now, if you've listened to the podcast for long enough, you're probably aware that, yeah, that's something that you shouldn't do, and that's kind of a no-brainer. But you would be surprised how many times there are vulnerabilities that are discovered in X company's hardware management interface, whether that's a router, a switch, an enterprise server, whatever the case is. You'll be surprised how many times there'll be a vulnerability in that management interface, and how many of them are actively being exploited because they're accessible via the internet. You would be surprised. It's a non-zero number, which that should be a zero number because you shouldn't be publicly exposing your management interfaces for your infrastructure. So yeah, to me, this is a no-brainer, but apparently it's not for everyone. So whether it's a router, a switch, an IPMI interface that you use to manage a server directly, whether it's a hypervisor management interface with that's Proxmox, XCP&G, VMware, whatever it is, you should not be exposing that to the public internet. It should be behind your firewall, number one. And if you really want to be super secure about it, you should even put them on their own management VLAN, completely separate from everything else in your network. If you want to be uber safe, having all of those management interfaces on their own separate VLAN would definitely be the way to go. But at the bare minimum, don't expose it to the internet and have it behind your firewall. So if you really need to access your management interface, you should have some sort of VPN solution set up that you can securely and remotely access your internal infrastructure and manage it that way. So if you really need to access those interfaces, set up a VPN or something. Because that way you'll be a lot more secure and safe and won't have to worry about some attacker getting into your hypervisor instance and completely destroying your entire home lab remotely for the lulz. So don't be that guy. Make sure that you don't have your management interfaces exposed to the internet. And this also includes your router, specifically, if you get a router from your ISP, make sure that is not accessible via the internet, since I know you can enable that. So make sure that is not enabled unless you really want to not have a fun time. So yeah, make sure your management interfaces are not accessible via the public internet. And that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. Moving right along, let's get into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. Now, I may or may not have spent an entire day working on my video game project to the point where I totally skipped lunch and almost dinner due to a marathon coding session. Now, of course, I can neither confirm nor deny any of these claims or allegations. But I will say, if you've listened to the podcast for long enough, I would assume you would probably have a good idea of if those claims have any merit to them and if they are truthful or not. But again, like I said, I can neither confirm nor deny them. So in addition, so in regards to the updates that I made, I had more than just one marathon coding session, but that was the one that specifically stuck out. But I did more than just that one. Like I mentioned in the previous episode, I was kind of doing the initial stages of connecting the back end and the front end system. So I was doing integrating them better, and making the experience a lot more smooth and streamlined and flow a lot better. It's still not perfect. There is still some things that need to be done as far as like animations are concerned. But as far as the majority of the text interface for status of what's going on, almost all of that is done at this point, at least done to the point of what I had implemented in the back end, because there's plenty of stuff in the back end as far as battles are concerned that I haven't implemented at all yet. But as far as to the point that things are implemented in the back end, almost all of that is reflected in the front end. So that was part of the marathon coding session that went down. But in addition to that, I also redid how I handle external dependencies in my build system. So I believe this is at least the second, if not the third time, maybe more. I don't know. I kind of lost count how many times I've redone the build system. But I redid the build system again. So previously, what I did was I would download Raylib. I would download the Git repository, doing a Git clone, and build the library from source. And this worked good, except it had one minor drawback. And that is that I was working with a developer build. And if you've ever worked with beta or alpha or otherwise dev software that isn't a release build, it can be buggy. And I am definitely one that has, been victim. Well, I have produced buggy code that hasn't been, fully finalized to a release format yet. And the reason why I wanted to switch to this was partly for stability's sake, but also because it already has bit me once. Because one time, I forget exactly what I was testing, but I was doing some testing with my code that was using some of the Raylib functions, and I realized I was getting errors and things weren't working. And at first, I thought it was my code, but then I was like, wait a second, I didn't change anything here, so nothing should be working. So then for a sanity check, I downloaded the release version of the Raylib library, compiled against that, and then everything worked fine. So that is one thing to be cautious of if you are using dev versions or dev builds of libraries or applications or software in general. Don't expect it to be flawless because it's a dev build for a reason. It's not a release build. So yeah. But anyway, so I basically wrote a Python script to handle all the external dependencies that I'll ever need. And I decided to go above and beyond because in addition of pulling down the latest release for Raylib, so I can then build against it and compile like I normally would, I also made the script universal. So basically what I can do now in my build system, in my make file, is I can run the Python script and pass it in two parameters, the first being the username of whoever is the owner of the Git repo and the Git repo itself. So any repository on GitHub that has a releases page, I will be able to use this script to download the latest release, extract the source code, and then be able to compile that source code into a library if it has one, and then build my code against that. So that was kind of a pretty big update that I made that I was pretty happy about for the build system. And overall, I think it kind of streamlines the process a lot better than before. Not having to use Git pools and Git clones all the time and potentially working with dev builds. So at least this time I know that I'm dealing with a release build, and it should, at least in theory, be stable since it's a release build. So I won't have to worry about wondering if this is a bug because of something that I wrote or if this is a bug because it's a dev build and not a release build. So that was what I was up to this week. Now, getting into the main topic for this episode is productivity tracking for software development. So this is, I don't know if I'd necessarily say a hot topic, but it definitely has some strong opinions in both directions. Some people are very anti any kind of productivity tracking. They just want to be in their own lane, head down, hands on the keyboard, click, clack away, and not be bothered by any of that. Other people want everything to be documented. You have to have a story for everything, and everything needs to be tracked. So there's two camps. Both have their claims, both sides have pros and cons. So in this episode, I kind of wanted to get into that and not necessarily say which way is better than the other, but give you the tools and the thoughts about which you think is best for your given environment. So I guess for the first thing we have to start with before we get into specifically the productivity trackers like, your Jira's, Confluence, Notion, all that good stuff, is the initial stuff when it comes to when you first start a project. Contrary to what they teach you in your software development capstone class in college, not every project needs a requirements document and a design document. I know that might be a shock to some people, but it's true that you do not need either of those in, I would say, a decent amount of cases, especially if it's a personal project. You probably don't need it. The main point of those documents is if you're working with like a customer, for example, basically setting the ground rules for what you agree to make. So this can help prevent things like scope creep and that kind of a thing and help you stay kind of on task. The problem is these documents can potentially hinder the software development process. And what I mean by that is if you go, it really depends on how in-depth you get into the weeds on these things. But in essence, if you state exactly how the software is supposed to be, if come implementation time, you find that the solution that's in the requirements and design document doesn't work, well, you're kind of out of luck, because if you're, dealing with, a customer, for example, and you both agreed that this is how the software is going to work, and then once you actually finally get to implementing it, you realize that's not either feasible or that's not practical, well, you really don't have a choice but to either implement it and have it be broken, which is obviously not ideal, or you have to go through the whole process of going back through the requirements and the design and getting it reapproved and all that stuff, which again slows down the process. So it can definitely have a lot of downtime if you run into these issues frequently. Now, when I say that they can hinder the software development process, I think it has to be said that documentation is key, and I've said on multiple occasions that you should document things like your code and the build process and how to run the thing. But you have to find a good balance between the right amount of documentation for the project. So, for instance, if you're doing a weekend project, like you want to create a game of life simulator, or you want to write a snake game or something, some other kind of like, weekend style project, something that'll take you, a few hours, but not something that's going to take you weeks and months or potentially even years. Personally, you don't need a 10-page requirements document with a 20-page design document just to show how the thing's going to work. Like, at least in my opinion, that's a complete waste of time. So, but that's also, in fairness, that's a lot smaller scope than, some of the bigger projects that, say, enterprises are working on, or video game studios are working on, or companies like, Google, Apple, not Mac OS. What am I talking about? Microsoft, working on operating systems, big projects like that. Yeah, you could probably benefit from a design and requirements document, but so it really kind of depends on the scale. But at least in my opinion, if you are writing a requirements and design document for what I would call a weekend project, in my opinion, you're kind of wasting your time. Unless you're going at it strictly for the experience of writing those documents, you would finish the project a heck of a lot faster if you just skipped those and just went straight to implementation. Now, like I said, you should, however, document your code with good comments and have some kind of README or something for how to build it and how to run the project, because sometimes it might not be all that straightforward, or, you come back to it a few years from now and you don't remember everything that it does, so you kind of need a refresher. So it not only helps others, but it also helps you. And like I mentioned, I can't tell you how many times I have come back to a project after a few months or heck, even a few weeks of not touching it for a while, and I'll look at the code and be like, what the heck is this doing? And have to like relearn what I was trying to do. So having good comments in your code can make that process a lot easier. But also when it comes to documenting your code, it's a lot more than just writing comments. Documenting your code can also be variable names and object names. So rather than making a random variable called A, what is A? That's a great question. Let me read through 10 lines of code to try to maybe get an understanding. Or you could instead call it counter, and you might have a better understanding. Okay, that's trying to count and monitor how much of something there is. So things like that, making sure you have good names for your variables and your objects, can definitely help that process as well in adding to the documentation of your code, even if you're not specifically, writing comments. So those types of things, as far which you should do, regardless of if it's a weekend project or a large-scale project. But going back to the requirements in the design document, though, anyone that's programmed for more than 5 minutes has a pretty good understanding of the fact that plans change, sometimes multiple times over the course of developing and implementing the code. So I mean, a great example is the video game I'm working on. If you've listened to the podcast for long enough, you've heard me talk about it. Over the past year, I basically did a complete rewrite of the vast majority of the classes, in large part because I figured out a better way to implement stuff. But if I had gone through the entire process of writing the design document, requirements document, all that stuff, it would basically be completely out of date and complete garbage because I changed everything because I realized this is a better way of doing things. So that's one way. And another thing is, too, I'm not sure about you guys, but I know for me personally, like when I'll have an initial idea going into a project of how I want to implement something, and then I'll start getting into the weeds, writing the code for it, writing the algorithm, and then realize, oh, wait a second, this actually isn't going to work, and then have to go change and redo stuff. If you write out the whole requirements and design document, yeah, that's great, and maybe it'll help prevent some of these types of issues, but it's not going to prevent all of them. No matter how good you plan, you're going to run into these issues where things don't go exactly as planned and you have to change things on the fly. So you could make the argument that heavily doing documentation up front could prevent some of these, cases, but not all of them. So you'll have to change your plans anyway. So here is a thought experiment that I want you to think about. Not saying one way is right, one way is wrong, but which one would get you to a finished product faster? Putting pedal to the metal and just going right out of the gate, starting to write code and figure things out as you go, or doing all the documentation up front and then using that documentation to help guide your coding process. There's pros and cons to each. You can make arguments for both ways, but in both cases, you will run into hurdles that you will have to overcome that you couldn't have planned for if you did the documentation ahead of time. Now, some would argue doing the documentation ahead of time means you don't have to do it at the end. And if you didn't do the documentation ahead of time, you might finish first, but you don't have any documentation to show for it, and you'd have to write that later, assuming you write any. So there's definitely pros and cons to each one. But like I said, it really depends on the scope of the project, right? If it's like a weekend type project or something you're just trying to hack together, definitely not necessary to have any of those types of big documents documenting how the thing works. Unless you just want to do it for the experience, then by all means go for it. Now, on to, I guess the last thing I want to say is when it comes to developers, they need flexibility to make changes as they see fit and what works best in regards to how the program will be used and the optimization of it. Because at the end of the day, that's what the developer is there for. That's what they get paid for, is to implement the code the best they can. If you are a developer and you've ever seen code written by non-developers, it sometimes can make you sick. Maybe that's not the right word, but it is definitely, I'll just say it's easy to tell when someone that isn't a developer and doesn't really have development experience writes code versus an actual developer writes code. Because in both cases, the code might work, but I'd say like 99% of the time, the code written by the developer, at least to other developers, makes a heck of a lot more sense, is easier to follow, easier to make changes to. Because I have worked on a few projects in my professional career that were written by non-developers, and needless to say, it was kind of hard to follow the code at a good amount of times when I was trying to do stuff with it. So, yeah. The developers need to have, the ability and the flexibility to be able to, make the changes that they see fit that would make the program run better. And having super strict, hardline rules and requirements and design that dictates how they implement stuff could potentially hinder that process. So it is something that you do have to be careful about. Now, getting on to productivity trackers specifically, a lot of companies use a bunch of different tools, so there's no one right tool to use, but specifically the ones that come to mind are, your Jira, Confluence, Monday.com, Notion. Other people use like the issue tracking capabilities on like GitHub or GitLab or their Git repo of choice. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can like kind of track things that need to be done as far as the software development process goes. And the main reason and the main goals to track these projects is to make sure everyone's on task and to also help prevent scope creep. Now, it's not just companies and organizations that use these tools. I've actually seen like individual like solo devs like working on bigger projects that they're, just bigger personal projects, using some of these tools to try to help keep them on track. So it isn't, something that's exclusive, to a professional work environment. Some people use this, in their day-to-day. Like, just like, there's home labbers out there that run enterprise-grade equipment and software at their house because they can. They want the experience of working with that to help, either personal development because they want to, or possibly professional development to improve their career aspirations. They have different reasons for it, but just because something is used in the, corporate world doesn't mean it's exclusive to that. There's people that tinker around with this stuff in their personal lives as well. So here, I guess, comes to, the justifications if you should use them or you shouldn't use them. So starting off with, the justifications of why companies and people elect to use these productivity tracker things is, number one would be resource allocation. So being able to track productivity also can help you track how to better manage your resources. So this is kind of more from a project management aspect rather than a software development aspect. So you'll kind of notice a trend here that the productivity software really kind of is there for the project managers and kind of the higher up people, not really the software developers themselves. Now, granted, there is some benefit to software developers, but a lot of it, at least in my opinion, is for kind of management to kind of see how project is going on the project that they're either having to advocate for or paying for, whatever the case may be. So the resource allocation component would potentially see management if they're noticing that, the different stories on these boards aren't being completed as quick as they'd like. That could be an inclination to them that maybe they need to either hire more people or pool more people onto the project to get them working on it to try to get those tasks met and finished, completed in a more timely fashion to their liking. And it also can ensure that people are, have enough work themselves. So if you see that, one person only has like 2 tasks assigned to them and they knock them out pretty quickly, that can, show you that, okay, we can assign them more work to do and kind of, keep them with work to do, essentially. It also can help with project planning too. So if you can kind of see, assuming that you accurately depict how long each of these tasks will take, it can help with planning the project, because if you see that, we normally are able to accomplish X number of stories worth X number of points, you can be able to track, okay, so within, say, the next 2 months, 3 months, however long you're planning for, you can assume that you'll be able to knock out this much amount of work based on the tasks that are on your board or whatever, and how many points are assigned to each one of them. So it can, and you can see, look into the past, see how long it took to complete tasks of similar point values, and then be able to use that to project into the future, to basically just try to keep people on task and give realistic timelines rather than, oh yeah, it'll be done in a week. And then a week turns into 2, which turns into a month, and then you finally get it done about a month and a half late. So it can potentially help you with that as well. And it also, kind of tying into the resource allocation bit a little bit, is identifying bottlenecks. So if you notice that, for example, you have like a junior developer that's new to the team, doesn't necessarily have a ton of experience, and you notice that they're struggling to knock all the tasks that are assigned to them off, that could potentially be a bottleneck, and you could maybe see, okay, now I see this, junior dev Johnny over here is struggling to finish the tasks that are assigned to him. I can move one of the senior devs over to, help him out a little bit, maybe do some peer programming, or just give him some tips to hopefully help his development process and get him, finishing those tasks that are assigned to him. So this can also help lead to faster development cycles too, because if you can get rid of these bottlenecks, it'll allow you to, complete more of these tasks, get more, stories checked off the box, get more things done and implemented, and, speed up the overall development process of whatever the project happens to be. Another one, again, really focusing in on the project management side of things, is performance evaluation. So whenever you deal in management, you inevitably have to, determine, are people performing as well as they should, and are they meeting expectations? Well, having a productivity tracker basically gives you all that data right there, because you can see which tasks were assigned to who, how many tasks have they completed, and you can basically track the performance and the progress of various individuals for whatever kind of performance evaluation needs you would need to. And then client expectations is another one. So again, kind of if the client that is paying for this software project to be built, obviously they're going to enjoy a productivity tracker, because they can see their the hard work being put in, and their dollars are being spent, and it's actually worth their money, because they can see that progress is being made. So they can clearly see, there's transparency and accountability, that progress is actually being done, and it's not just, a developer or the project manager, whoever, saying, yeah, we're working on it. The client can actually see for themselves how close that feature they want implemented is to being done, or how close the overall project is to being done, or whatever the case may be. And kind of, I guess, the capstone for all of that would be continuous improvement. So when you have all this data in regards to how your team is functioning, the overall productivity, you can identify various patterns and trends to be able to continue improving the overall development process, and just, yeah. So those are the justifications for it. As you'll notice, it is very, very project management heavy. You'll notice I didn't mention a whole lot about how it benefits developers, which is kind of the theme here. Developers, generally speaking, just kind of like to write code. They honestly couldn't be bothered, with what anyone else thinks, like the higher-ups. They're just here to do their job. They're here to write code, and they honestly don't care, which is generally why you don't have developers interface directly with customers, because how it usually goes is you'll have the developer, the customer, it's like, yeah, talking in a idealized world, this is what I want, type of a thing. And the developer's like, oh yeah, we can totally do that, not really thinking about the implications about the project as a whole. And then they make promises, and then scope creep happens, and it's not a very fun time. But yeah, so the productivity tracking, at least in my opinion, is mainly for the project managers and management in general, as well as whoever's paying for the software to be built. It's mainly for them, not as much for the developers. But again, developers can have some benefit to it also, because if they see, what tasks they have coming up, can potentially help them, maybe better allocate their time, or how they want to implement stuff to better integrate with something down the road. So it can be beneficial to them too, but again, mostly for the management side of the house. So now we get into why productivity trackers aren't necessary. And here you're going to notice a theme that this mostly is addressing developers rather than management. So kind of we're flipping the roles here a little bit. So creativity and innovation is number one, why it's unnecessary. So kind of in relation to what we talked about a little bit ago with, documentation and requirements documents and that kind of a thing, an overemphasis on productivity metrics can potentially stifle creativity and innovation, and developers can feel pressured to meet metrics, which could potentially hinder the potential for them to come up with a creative or a novel solution. So if they know that they have to implement, X feature within, 2 weeks, and they have hard deadlines for, the various stories that are assigned to them and the tasks that are assigned to them, they're going to just try to knock all those out as quickly as they can, rather than potentially thinking of, is there a better way that I can do this? Rather, they're just going to, do the first thing that pops into their head, which may or may not be the best way to implement something. It might not be the most optimized way. I don't know about you, but I know usually the first attempt that I do of writing code to get something working is not the final state of the code. But if you're really tasked with getting stuff done and things need to be done at, specific intervals to meet whatever your metrics are, that code you write on the first pass very well might be the final code, which, like I've experienced, and I'm sure a lot of you that are developers have experienced, that first pass of the code generally isn't the best code. Whether it's not as optimized or it's not as easy to read and follow, whatever the case may be, having metrics that you're forced to meet could potentially yield less good code, I guess, for lack of a better term. So that kind of moves into the second reason why they're unnecessary, which is quality over quantity. So when you're trying to meet metrics, you're mainly just focused on pumping out as much code as possible, getting as many features done as possible, rather than ensuring the quality of that code is well written, making sure that code is very reusable. You're not rewriting multiple things of code. You're not writing spaghetti code. All this stuff, if you're just focused purely on pumping out as much code as possible, trying to meet metrics, the likelihood that the quality of said code is probably going to go down, because it's kind of do you want high quality code or do you want a lot of code? Because you can write a lot of code, but it's may or may not be the best quality code. Because I don't know about you, but personally, as a developer, I would much rather the development process take a little bit longer and have the code be readable and followable and manageable, rather than everything get pumped out really quickly and everything is all a tangled mess of spaghetti all intertwined together. And then when you inevitably have to come back and change things, you're spending months trying to untangle the spaghetti because you didn't write the best code initially. So that can be another thing that, being forced to meet certain metrics can force developers to rush through writing the code and not necessarily write as good of code. This can introduce bugs and all kinds of other potential issues. And here comes the next reason why productivity trackers might not be the best solution, and that is for motivation and morale. So if you recall back, I don't remember when it was, maybe a couple months ago at this point, we talked about burnout and why developers aren't loyal. And part of the reason is because if their whole purpose in life is to just churn out as much code as possible, and they're basically not even told to, write good code. They're like, we just need this code done. We don't care, just get it done. It can definitely lead to burnout. So the constant tracking can definitely negatively impact a team's morale if they feel like they're constantly being hounded to get all this stuff done, and they feel like they can't put as good of a job into it potentially. And also, having this kind of not necessarily big brother aspect, but having this kind of board that dictates everything that you have to do can potentially feel micromanaging to certain developers, which could also potentially lead to burnout. Because one thing that I think probably might not be realized by managers is oftentimes during the development process, when you're writing code for, say, whatever task you're working on, you may realize that you have to implement something else, but if that's in order to either make it work more efficiently or just to be better integrated, whatever the case may be, if you don't have the freedom to, go implement that thing, and you have to strictly focus and keep to what's on your tasks that are assigned to you, that can be kind of demoralizing because you kind of feel like you can't write the code the way you feel it should be written. So also that could, leads to burnout. You just kind of feel unmotivated. So that's another thing that these productivity trackers can potentially pose a detriment to when it comes to developers. So then another kind of potential detriment is varied nature of work. So one thing in software development is it's kind of nice to be able to do different things, try different, implementations of stuff, work on different projects. Problem solving is kind of the name of the game when it comes to software development. And one of the issues with productivity tracking and metrics in general is if it's seen that you're like the expert on implementing, say, kernel level stuff, you're probably only ever going to do kernel level stuff because that's what they see you're good at. So that's just what they're going to keep giving you code to write for. But if you say you want to branch out and, maybe you want to write some web stuff, that's probably not going to happen. You're probably not going to be able to do that. So it kind of can constrain developers potentially if they're strictly focused on trying to meet certain metrics. Management's not going to want to let them branch out to do stuff they might not be as good at or not be as efficient at. So that could potentially be another downside. And this leads into the next point, which is adaptability. Because if you have everyone focusing strictly on what they're good at, if you take that one person away, what are you left with? You have a big hole in your team. Whereas if you have everyone kind of working on different pieces of the code, kind of mix and matching, you might not necessarily have super depth as far as your expertise is concerned, but if for some reason you lose a developer due to burnout, or you lose a developer for whatever reason, because developers seem to leave pretty quickly, you have people that can take over the reins and you're not left scrambling trying to fill that position. So strict productivity tracking can potentially inhibit the team's ability to adapt to changing requirements and other unforeseen challenges like a developer leaving, for example. So, maybe not being quite as strict on the tracking of metrics and everything could potentially and allow developers to kind of work on things that they kind of want to work on rather than what's strictly assigned to them, could potentially help them be more adaptable and be able to work on other things rather than just what they're potentially good at. And the last kind of bit that I wanted to touch on is trust and autonomy. So kind of similar to some of the other ones on the list, if having that big board there that you have to update all the time, some developers could see that as the management doesn't trust them to get the job done, which if you've been in management, you maybe say that's not justified or it is justified. I mean, you can, look at it however you want to, but from the developer's perspective, if you're constantly like checking in on them to see if they're getting their work done, it kind of gives the impression that you're trying to micromanage them and you don't trust them to, do their job. So that can potentially be a ramification of having a productivity tracker and sticking to it like it's the gospel, can potentially lead to developers, losing trust in management or lack of trust in the overall team to get the job done. Now, I'm not saying that is either justified or unjustified. I'm just saying that's, what some developers think about. But I think just in general, if you think about it, just if you take software development out of it and you put it into a more general context. If you have, say, a group of people and you're supposed to be their leader, and you tell them to go do something, and every 5 minutes you're checking in with them to see if they did stuff, they're probably going to get kind of annoyed with you and not trust you, because you obviously are showing that you don't trust them because you're constantly checking in on them. Now, that's not to say you shouldn't ever check in on them, because you do need to make sure the work's getting done, but the constant, barrage of, checking in kind of, erodes the trust between the two people. So just another reason why potentially they might not be necessary. But at the end of the day, what it comes down to is the team and the project. So I think the best approach would be to have the team of the developers that are going to be doing the development with whatever management or whatever would be kind of wanting to implement something like this, kind of get them in a room and discuss, is this something we need, and kind of, look at the pros and cons, kind of like what we discussed here today, and see if it's something that's worthwhile doing. Does the size of the project you're working on justify something like this? Does it not? So it's definitely something that you have to really evaluate on a project by project basis. There's no really kind of one fits all solution, like basically everything in home labbing, software development, technology, IT in general. It always comes down to it depends. Everyone's favorite answer, it depends. Now, if you're doing a solo development thing, and you want the experience of using these kinds of tools, then I say by all means, knock yourself out. I think it'd be a fantastic learning experience. But if your project isn't that big, to be honest, I'd probably save yourself the headache, unless, like I said, it's something that you want to do to try to, get more experience. So yeah, mainly comes down to the team and the project, which I think mainly determines whether this is something that you should implement or not. So definitely something you'd have to talk between the development team and the management side to find what the best solution is. And with that, I think we should move into our trivia question before we wrap up. So as you'll recall, the trivia question for this week is, which cereal brand included a toy capable of producing the 2600 hertz tone used by phone phreakers to give them free long-distance calls? If you said Captain Crunch and a whistle, you are correct. So back in the day, when payphones were still a thing, the way that they would kind of, verify or, basically if you use this tone, it would basically bypass the system and allow you to give you a free long distance call. So kind of cool piece of trivia there. Hopefully some of you got it right if you're older and remember the payphone days. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't, I'm not sure. But hopefully some of you out there got it right. And if you enjoyed this episode, you know what to do. Leave it a rating, review, share it around. And if you have any questions or topics for future episodes, definitely feel free to reach out to me at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. You can also click the link down in the show notes below. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.